All right, good morning, everyone. I'm Alan Carr. Welcome again to the 18th Annual Needham Healthcare Conference. We're going to get going with Acadia here. We're happy to have them with us again. And to give us an update and overview is CEO Steve Davis.
Great. Thanks much, Alan. This morning I need to start by reminding us all that the business of pharmaceuticals is fairly unpredictable. So please see a copy of our latest SEC filings for a description of the risks that relate to our business. On this slide, what you see on the left-hand side are actual pictures of actual patients, and on the right-hand side are pictures of our employees. And I just want to simply say, I'd like to remind everyone at the beginning of our discussions that there's nothing that motivates us more than trying to help these people. I know many times in our business it's easy to get focused on stock price, CAGR, revenues, etc. That's really important. But treating these people is what really drives our employees, and I just want to say we're proud to represent their interests in everything that we do. There are three strategic pillars to achieving our vision. First is to grow NUPLAZID as the only approved treatment and standard of care for Parkinson's psychosis patients. Second is to leverage the potential of pimavanserin, which is the generic name for NUPLAZID, by expanding to additional indications with significant unmet need. And third is to expand our pipeline through focused business development in CNS disorders with high unmet needs. Let me just touch on a few recent highlights regarding our execution of this strategy. In terms of growing NUPLAZID sales, in the fourth quarter of 2018, we reported net sales of $59.6 million. That represented a 37% year-over-year growth. For 2018 full-year sales, we recorded $223.8 million. That was a 79% year-over-year growth. We launched a 34 milligram capsule in the third quarter of 2018, an important step in furthering the evolution of the compound and being able to work some things out of the system that we wanted to eliminate. I'll touch on that more in a moment. And that set us up to initiate a branded DTC campaign in the fourth quarter of 2018. As a consequence of the growth that we're seeing, we've guided 2019 fiscal year sales to $275 to $300 million. In terms of leveraging, most recent highlight is in major depressive disorder, where we announced positive results in our phase 2 Clarity study. We then completed our end of phase 2 meeting with FDA, and our phase 3 program is on track to initiate in the first half of this year. In dementia-related psychosis, our phase 3 Harmony study is progressing. In schizophrenia, we'll have top-line results from our phase 3 Enhanced study in the middle of this year. In terms of expanding, we acquired North American rights to trofinetide, and we'll be initiating a phase 3 program in the second half of this year. It's worth noting, we also strengthened the balance sheet with a successful financing. In 2018, our year-end cash balance is $474 million. I think this may be the most important slide for kind of understanding our business today and the opportunity that we see with pimavanserin. On the far left-hand side of the slide, you see the addressable population in Parkinson's disease psychosis. And as we've said many times, we think that this drug has great potential and can be a very significant drug just in PDP. If you look to the right-hand side, you see the 4 indications that we're pursuing that are all in late-stage development. You've heard me say before, I love making these kinds of investments. It's the same molecule. We already know the safety and tolerability profile. We know the drug interactions. We know how to make it. We know everything about the molecule. The one thing that we didn't know when we started these studies a couple of years ago is the full extent of the utility of the drug. And we're now unveiling that study, one study at a time. So far, it appears to be working in everything that we tried. So we're very excited about this de-risked opportunity ahead of us to expand the utility of pimavanserin. In schizophrenia inadequate response, you can see that is roughly a 5-fold increase over the size of PDP, schizophrenia negative symptoms about 8-fold. It's about 10-fold for for dementia-related psychosis, and major depressive disorder is about 20-fold. So all told, it's about a 40-fold increase in the addressable population if we're successful in all of these. I'm going to go a little deeper on the commercial opportunity ahead in PDP. Current commercial initiatives for growing NUPLAZID in PDP include a successful transition to the 34 milligram capsule that we are in the process of completing now. And I mentioned earlier that this was important because when the drug was launched, it was launched with 2 17 milligram tablets taken together once a day. And although the drug was studied at 34 milligrams, and 34 milligrams is the approved dose, physicians many times would titrate a patient, start them on 17, then ultimately, most of the time, move them up to 34 milligrams. And that resulted in a delayed onset of the drug and a potentially diluted effect. So we've worked that out of the system now, and that was an important transition for us. In the second half of last year, we also launched commercial initiatives designed to get at a communication gap that exists between patients and caregivers on one hand and physicians on the other. So when a patient is first diagnosed with Parkinson's, they typically don't have hallucinations or delusions at that stage. They tend to develop more in the more advanced stage. They can occur early, but tend to occur more in the advanced stages of the disease. But when they occur, it's been a long time since they were diagnosed, and many times patients, first of all, physicians don't often flag this for them when they're first diagnosed because they don't know if it'll happen. It only happens in half the patients, but in the other half where it does occur, it may be many years since they first spoke to their doctor about this. And so it just goes undetected, and the patient and the caregiver doesn't connect the dots. So one significant lever we have to try to solve that communication gap is a DTC campaign that we launched on Thanksgiving Day of last year. Most recently, pimavanserin has been highlighted as an efficacious treatment for psychosis in Parkinson's patients in the updated MDS, that's Movement Disorder Society, Commission review for the treatment of non-motor symptoms in PD. And I'd just like to highlight that pimavanserin was highlighted as the only antipsychotic that's demonstrated to be efficacious and has an acceptable safety profile without special monitoring. I mentioned the DTC campaign is an important element in us increasing PDP awareness. And I thought it'd be helpful just to explain a little bit about the patient journey that a typical patient goes through in terms of first becoming aware that the hallucinations and delusions they're experiencing may be identified, may be associated with a Parkinson's disease, and then ultimately getting to be a paid patient of ours. So once a patient becomes aware, it may be 6 weeks or so before they actually get to their doctor. Most of these patients see their neurologist every 3 months. Sometimes it's every 6 months. Sometimes it's every 6 weeks. But generally, it'll be several weeks before they see their doctor. Once they visit their doctor, if they prescribe NUPLAZID, it takes some time to get through the adjudication process. We bridge that with free drug while it's being adjudicated. But once they get through that process and they get through the free drug, then they convert to a patient on a paid bottle. So the upshot of this is it can take up to a quarter from the time they first become aware to the time they become a paid patient. And of course, when they start in a quarter, they don't produce full revenue in that quarter. It's partial for that quarter, and it's the next quarter after that before we get the full revenue benefit of that patient. And for this reason, we've indicated that the DTC campaign that we initiated on Thanksgiving Day is more likely to be impactful, or be more impactful in the second quarter this year, and less so in the first quarter. I know that these kinds of slides, these swim lane slides, are very common in our industry. I'd just like to point out two things on this slide. One is, while it's not uncommon when you have a drug approved for one indication to go pursue other possibilities, many times what we see is those additional indications have the potential for adding incremental value. And that in our case, any one of these indications has significant standalone value. And as I mentioned, they're all dramatically larger than PDP. Second thing I'd like to point out is we have 5 late-stage clinical development programs this year, which we think will give us a lot of momentum as we progress through this year and into next. Just going to touch on a few recent R&D highlights. I mentioned we completed our end-of-phase 2 meeting with the FDA, confirming our phase 3 program for pimavanserin in depression. I should also just note that in that end-of-phase 2 meeting, as we expected, the FDA confirmed that the phase 2 Clarity study that we ran will qualify as a pivotal study, one of 2 pivotal studies needed for approval. And of course, as is the case with all end-of-phase 2 matters, it's obviously subject to review of the sNDA. Second, we've confirmed our phase 3 study design with trofinetide and Rett syndrome with the FDA. And third, our schizophrenia inadequate response phase 3 ENHANCE study will read out top-line results in the middle of this year. I'm going to go a little deeper on some of these indications. Dementia-related psychosis, very high unmet need, no FDA-approved treatment. About 1.2 million people in the U.S. are diagnosed with DRP. It has serious consequences, including repeated hospital stays, earlier progression to nursing homes, more rapid progression of dementia, and increased risk of morbidity and mortality. In many ways, the situation in dementia-related psychosis is not unlike the situation in Parkinson's disease psychosis. In both cases, none of the antipsychotics prior to the approval of NUPLAZID were or are approved to treat those disorders. They all work by blocking dopamine. Of course, that's the last thing you want to do in a Parkinson's patient because you can make the primary symptom of the disorder worse. But a similar situation exists in dementia-related psychosis. It's been shown in a very large study that use of those previous generation dopaminergic antipsychotics can further impair cognition, the primary symptom in dementia, and it's not insignificant. It's equivalent to about 1 year of disease progression. And of course, in addition to that, you have all of the other well-known side effects of those drugs. Our phase 3 program builds on the phase 2 results that we achieved in an Alzheimer's disease psychosis study on the right-hand side of the slide, together with our Parkinson's disease study that was the pivotal study for the approval in PDP. And what we see here is a very similar pattern in terms of how the drug works in both of these populations. A very different underlying etiology, but in both cases we're treating psychosis, and the psychosis that is experienced between these is very, very similar. Should also note in the left-hand side of the slide, about a quarter of the patients that were enrolled in this study actually had dementia as well, and we saw very similar results with that subpopulation. So I mentioned this has been the basis for our phase 3 program. We're running a relapse prevention study, very simple study design. All patients start on our drug. After 12 weeks, we examine them. They're highly symptomatic. They start on our drug. If they respond to our drug at both week 8 and week 12, then they stay in the study. If they don't respond to our drug, they're eliminated from the study at that point. They don't know what happens at week 12, but at week 12, for those who stay in the study, they'll either stay on our drug or they'll move to placebo. And the endpoint of the study is simply a comparison between the rate of relapse of those that stay on NUPLAZID, where they received a benefit, versus those who received a benefit on NUPLAZID but now have been moved to a placebo. I'm going to shift to major depressive disorder. Depression is a very vast and significant disease in the U.S., about 16 million patients in total. A majority of patients, of depression patients, do not adequately respond to standard antidepressant therapy, that is The standard today is typically to start them on an SSRI or an SNRI, so drugs like Prozac or Lexapro. And of those who don't adequately respond, the majority of them don't adequately respond, 2.5 million of them are treated with adjunct therapy. And what we see on the left-hand side of this slide is the results of market research we did to better understand what do physicians really need in depression. And what we learned is they need better efficacy. Again, a majority of patients don't adequately respond. They need something else. Faster onset, treatment without sexual dysfunction. It's already an issue in many depression patients, and current antidepressant therapy, it can significantly exacerbate sexual dysfunction. Treatment without weight gain, treatment without daytime sleepiness, treatment without negative impact on motor function, including rare but serious tardive dyskinesias. In our very large phase 2 study, our Clarity study, we evaluated pimavanserin as adjunct therapy on top of SSRIs or SNRIs. And what we saw is very strong efficacy. I'll get to that a little bit more in the next slide. We achieved the primary endpoint in depression on the HAM-D17 scale. We also saw something that you don't often see with antidepressants, and that is we also had a positive on the key secondary endpoint, which is the Sheehan Disability Scale. So that's a measure of daily activities and things that illustrate how impaired a person is as a consequence of their depression. So we saw positive results there. We saw positive results on 7 additional pre-specified secondary endpoints. And now if you compare and contrast the left hand and the right hand, you see that we really mirrored the needs in terms of the results we saw with this drug. So we're very excited about this opportunity. You can see that we saw early efficacy in week 1. And we saw actually an improvement in sexual function. So many antidepressants can cause or exacerbate sexual dysfunction. We actually saw an improvement in this study. No meaningful weight gain, reduction in daytime sleepiness. I just want to clarify, that's a reduction. Again, many of the antidepressants, particularly those that are used as adjunctive therapy today, cause an increase in daytime sedation. It's a significant issue with those drugs. We saw a reduction in daytime sleepiness. That's something we've seen in other trials and other patient populations as well. And we have no motor function side effects that are observed. I spoke for a second about efficacy. The study that we did with Clarity had a standard stage 1 part, which is a parallel design that we often use in studying neuropsychiatric drugs. And in the stage 1 of the study, what we saw is an effect size of 0.626. That's a really significant antidepressant effect. What you tend to see with antidepressants is effect size in the 0.3 range, 0.4 range, etc. So getting a 0.626 is very significant in this population. On the basis of that study, and particularly those stage 1 results, which is a typical parallel design, we've now designed our phase 3 program, and we'll be doing 2 6-week randomized, double-blind, placebo-controlled, multi-center studies. Again, these are parallel design studies which have been the mainstay for approval of antidepressants. They more or less mimic the stage 1 results we saw in phase 2. Going to move to schizophrenia inadequate response. Today there are a number of drugs approved to treat schizophrenia, and many of them are generic. But there is no drug approved to treat schizophrenia patients who don't adequately respond, unlike the situation in depression. In schizophrenia, a third of patients will respond to dopaminergic, previous generation antipsychotics. About a third will partially respond, so they show a response, but they're still highly symptomatic. And about a third don't respond at all. It's that middle third that we're focused on studying in our phase 3 program, which we'll read out again in the middle of the year. And for those patients, there's nothing approved today. So as a consequence, what physicians often do is they do more of the same. Although the dopaminergic antipsychotics are all brothers, sisters, and cousins of each other, they'll give 2 or 3 at a time. And whether you get better efficacy or not is a question. But you definitely get added side effects. And so we believe that with pimavanserin's demonstrated antipsychotic activity and demonstrated favorable safety and tolerability profile, this could be an ideal drug to treat that third of schizophrenia patients that don't adequately respond. Again, as I mentioned, we'll have data from that study in the middle of the year. This is just a brief overview of the study itself. Again, it's a double-blind, placebo-controlled study with 380 patients, so it's a very large study. And we're administering pimavanserin on top of background antipsychotic therapy. So again, to address those patients that don't adequately respond when they take those drugs so that they'll have an alternative to just doing more of the same. Schizophrenia negative symptoms, here too, another area in schizophrenia where none of the antipsychotics are approved. Many of the antipsychotics move the needle on negative symptoms, but not sufficient to get an approval. By the way, negative symptoms capture more the social withdrawal aspects of the disease, where patients many times have a flat affect, loss of interest, emotional withdrawal, cognitive impairment, and it's been recognized for a few decades. It's one of the most troublesome symptoms of schizophrenia. In addition to none of the previous generation dopaminergic antipsychotics being approved to treat negative symptoms, they also have the same significant side effects that I've described before. So for those reasons, we believe pimavanserin is an excellent candidate to help the significant number of schizophrenia patients who continue to suffer negative symptoms. I mentioned that we in-licensed a compound for Rett syndrome. Rett syndrome is caused by mutations on the X chromosome on the MECP2 gene. Because it's a mutation on the X chromosome, most males die in utero, but females do not. And it is so for that reason, it's almost exclusively a female disorder. And it is a very debilitating neurological rare disease. There are about 6,000 to 9,000 patients in the U.S. There's no treatment approved to treat these girls. And what we typically see is these girls have normal development until they start a very rapid decline between 6 and 18 months of age. They get to a point where it's difficult for them to feed themselves, difficult to talk, difficult to walk. They have cognitive impairment, loss of independence, loss of purposeful hand use, and loss of spoken communication. The drug that we in-licensed is trofinetide. We acquired the North American rights to trofinetide. It's a novel synthetic analog of the tripeptide of IGF-1. It's designed to treat the core symptoms of Rett syndrome by reducing neuroinflammation and supporting synaptic function. In a phase 2 study that was key to our assessment of this opportunity, the company that we acquired rights from showed a statistically significant improvement in the Rett Syndrome Behavioral Questionnaire and in CGI. And as a consequence of those results, we've now designed and confirmed with FDA our phase 3 plan. That plan is to initiate in the second half of this year in 180 females with Rett syndrome. It'll be a double-blind, placebo-controlled study. Co-primary endpoints, again, are the Rett Syndrome Behavioral Questionnaire and CGI, 12 months in duration. And with positive results, we believe we have the potential to submit the NDA in 2021. This drug has fast-track status in the U.S., orphan drug designation in the U.S. and Europe for Rett syndrome. And just want to remind you that we have North American rights to this drug. Neuron Pharmaceuticals, the company that we in-license this from, is an Australian company, retains rights outside of North America. Just a quick recap of our clinical milestones. It's going to be a very busy year for us. As you can see, we we'll be commencing our phase 3 program in the first half of this year in major depressive disorder. We'll have results from the schizophrenia inadequate response phase 3 program in the middle of this year. In our dementia-related psychosis program, we'll have final results from the Harmony study in 2020. We will do an interim read in the second half of this year. In schizophrenia negative symptoms, we'll complete enrollment in our phase 2 advance study, and in Rett syndrome, we'll commence our phase 3 program. So again, 5 late-stage programs this year. Just to kind of wrap things up, a quick couple of comments on our financial guidance. In 2019, we've guided to $275 to $300 million this year. That represents a 28% revenue growth over 2018. It also represents, at the midpoint of that guidance, a 20% growth in volume year over year. Our GAAP R&D expense, we've guided to $250 to $265 million. GAAP SG&A, $280 to $295 million. And we ended the year with $474 million in cash, as I mentioned earlier. We're committed to executing on our 3-pillar strategy in 2019, again, to grow sales of NUPLAZID in Parkinson's disease psychosis, to bring home these other indications, determine where we can get approval and where we can significantly help the millions of patients that suffer from these other disorders we're pursuing with pimavanserin, and to continue to expand our pipeline. And again, trofinetide is a very good example of the kind of work that we're doing there. Okay, that's it. This may be a little bit unsatisfying today, but I'll be able to give you a much more satisfying answer as soon as we have the results. It really depends on the results of the study. So, and just to kind of give obvious color, if the results are, they could be such that we determine we're going to file on just that study. Of course, we have more schizophrenia results from the negative symptom study coming early next year. So we could determine we'd like to wait and try to cover that in the same application. It's also possible that we could determine we want to do yet another study and then file on that. So that's kind of the range of possibilities. But I would say once we have the envelope opened on this study, it'll help narrow things a lot.
You talked about timing for the results for the negative symptoms trial, and also maybe tell us about the rationale for why this drug might be effective in that particular
Yeah. So in negative symptoms, I've been in this business 6 years now, I guess. And the vast majority of my work's been in CNS disorders, and I've done a lot of work in schizophrenia and with antipsychotics in particular. And I would say one thing we know about the neuropsychiatric space is biochemistry is directional. It's not definitive. In our case, there's actually a biochemical rationale for why we could have an effect on negative symptoms. But much more importantly, we've actually seen in the clinic effects that suggest that this might be a good drug for treating the negative symptoms. And the results I'm referring to in the clinic are results of a phase 2 study done several years ago where we added pimavanserin, actually half the dose that we're approved at now, on top of another dopaminergic antipsychotic, and saw a strong antipsychotic effect. But within that effect, we saw effects both on positive and negative symptoms. In fact, they might have skewed a little bit more toward the negative symptoms. So that's very encouraging. And in addition, I wouldn't say there's a direct read-through to this at all, but I think recognizing that we saw this very strong antidepressant effect certainly doesn't hurt when we think about negative symptoms. It doesn't hurt that we have demonstrated in a few studies less daytime sedation than you get with other drugs. And so I think all of those qualities, which are all clinical findings, I think are supportive of the work we're doing here, and obviously we're eager to finish the study and get the results.
In the DRP study, what do you anticipate you would see after the results? What type of information are you expecting? show for the interim results of the readout?
Not sure I heard the full question. It was,
Dementia-related
yep.
psychosis, interim read, what type of data?
Oh, interim. Yeah, I got it. Yeah, I'm glad you asked. It's a very binary result. There's no bad outcome. It's either, and the question, by the way, was in the DRP study, interim read, what will we get out of that? And so when you do an interim read, you have to split your alpha. So we used a very small part of our alpha, assigned it to the interim read, which means the study is not powered for an interim read. So if we hit that very high bar, then we would stop the study by protocol. If we don't hit it, it's not a problem. We'll continue running the study, and then next year we'll have results from the full study.
Is this the top line?
Yeah. On the interim read, it's really nothing more than the independent body that does it saying you're going to go forward or you're going to stop, and the only reason that is prescribed to stop is on success, hitting this very high bar. Otherwise, we'll have top-line results next year.
Steve, if you had, let's assume that you had the successful, is that enough, or you actually need another bit in order to file for the adequate response?
Yeah. I hate to do this again, but it really does depend on the results of the study. The standard, of course, is 2 pivotal studies to get an approval. But we were successful in getting approval in Parkinson's disease psychosis on the basis of a single study. And so we just have to get the results of the study to really be able to gauge what the next best step would be. If we decide to wait for the negative symptoms results, it wouldn't necessarily be because we feel like that's needed, but we might determine that that would be sufficiently beneficial in the label to get it in from the beginning that we might want to wait. Yeah. I mean, the thing that's most remarkable is that nothing's changed. The safety profile that we see with the drug in the real world is almost exactly what we saw in the clinical study that served as the basis of approval in PDP. And as we've done more studies now in Alzheimer's patients and schizophrenia patients, depression patients, we just see this very consistent safety and tolerability profile. It's unlike any other antipsychotic. All other antipsychotics on the market, the previous generation dopaminergic antipsychotics, have significant, well-documented safety and tolerability issues. So I think that's one of the reasons that pimavanserin has the potential to be a really important new tool. Great. Thank you all.